Shebahonaning, Shebahonaning. This sketch, called Shebahonaning, was published in 1855 by Lawrence Oliphant, former Civil Secretary and Superintendent General of Indian Affairs in Canada. We are looking toward the west end of the channel. George Island is on the left side of the sketch. On the right, on the mainland, is Dilemmandir's trading post and part of the village of Shebahonaning. Ani and good day. My name is Adele Loosemore and I am from Shebahonaning. My community is located at the entrance to the North Channel of Georgian Bay in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area. On the map below, I put a white dot to show where we are located. I hope you enjoy this video. Our First Nations ancestors are Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. But the Métis Nation of Ontario and the Province of Ontario decided to change their ethnic identity to Métis. They did this by distorting some parts of the historic record and ignoring other parts of it. This manipulation of our ethnic identity is deeply disrespectful to our ancestors and our community, and it violates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This series of videos was created to show you that their claims are not supported by the historic record. In 2017, the Métis Nation of Ontario and the Province of Ontario designated Killarney and its environs a historic Métis community. This time, let's take a closer look at the families living inside Shebahonaning. What evidence did the Métis Nation of Ontario use to declare members of these families documented Métis? Here's a brief recap about MNO's method of classifying ancestors as Métis. In both their 2017 and 2019 registry policies, they give examples of the kinds of words you might find in old records. Words that they claim mean the same thing as Métis. The documents that MNO most often relies on are the 1901 Canadian Census, the 1899 Report on Robinson Treaty Annuities, and vital statistics records. In other words, birth, baptismal, marriage, and death documents. The box at the bottom of the page was taken from MNO's document about the Solomon family, and it says that they were identified as documented Métis because they are named as people of mixed Indian-European ancestry in the 1901 census, and they were called half-breeds in the 1899 report on Robinson Treaty Annuities. This next part is all about the 1899 report on Robinson Treaty Annuities. I'm not going to go into all the events that led up to this report or try to explain all of the effects it had. I'm just trying to give you an overview of what it was about, because the Métis Nation of Ontario uses this report to classify our ancestors as Métis. That report was the result of an Indian Affairs investigation into who had a legal right to an annuity under the Robinson Superior and Robinson Huron treaties of 1850. They're shown on the map at the left in orange. I added a black dot to the map to show the location of Shebahonaning. Our ancestors were members of bands that were part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. The government had been keeping lists of the families who received these annual payments that were owed to them under the treaties. Those families were investigated by the Inspector of Indian Agencies and Reserves, J.A. McCrae, and his job was to recommend who should be taken off the treaty pay lists. The image is part of the 1899 report. In the handwriting at the top of each column is the name of the Indian Agency offices. Parry Sound and Manitowoc, the ones named first, are the offices that dealt with people in Shebahonaning. Also listed are Sault Ste. Marie and Port Arthur. The red circle that I added at the bottom of the image shows the total number of people receiving or claiming that they had a right to receive treaty annuities. McCrae spent only 25 days doing this investigation that involved almost 6,000 people. McCrae relied mostly on Indian agents to provide family histories, as well as their opinions about whether persons should remain on the pay list or be added to the pay list. In his opinion, a person's entitlement to treaty benefits was weak or non-existent if, for example, those rights were based on a female's band membership rather than a male's band membership, or if a person was not living with the band through which their legal right to an annuity arose. He didn't like people moving to another reserve. Or if a person was not living in a traditional manner. For example, being a hunter or a trapper was acceptable, but being something like a commercial fisherman or a steamboat captain was not acceptable. By the time McCrae was doing this investigation, Indian people were not all living in a traditional way. There certainly were people who were hunters and trappers, but there were also people who worked at other occupations, as this table shows. And McCrae realized this. He advised the department not to use the idea of an Indian way of life to determine whether or not people were entitled to treaty annuities, because, he said, there were many widely divergent views about what an Indian way of life is. But that didn't stop him from using non-traditional occupations as a reason for recommending that some people should be taken off the treaty pay list. McCrae was inconsistent in his recommendations, including on the issue of whether or not half-breeds should be allowed to remain on the treaty pay lists. The settler government had included half-breeds in its laws relating to Indians, but they were a fast-growing part of the Indian population. Removing them from the treaty pay lists was one way for government to reduce its financial obligations. During his investigation, McCrae discovered that if an Indian agent decided that a person should not be receiving treaty annuities, but there was no justifiable basis for removing that person's name from the treaty pay list, Indian agents simply did not add their children to the list. This would prevent treaty annuities from being paid out to the next generation of that family. It appears that this practice was the inspiration for McCrae's recommendation that some Indians should be allowed only a non-transmissible right to annuities. Some people lost their treaty rights. they were removed from the pay list, and some people's rights became non-transmissible, meaning that Indian Affairs would leave those people on the treaty pay list, but they would not recognize the rights of any of their children who were born after a certain year. So in many families, some children had treaty rights and others did not. In many communities, including Shebahonaning, several families were assigned non-transmissible rights. In 1917, Indian Affairs decided to reverse this practice after years of constant complaints from First Nations people who did not understand or agree with the department's actions. The Métis Nation of Ontario uses comments in this report as evidence that our ancestors were Métis, and I'll be showing you some of those comments. The image on the left side is part of a treaty pay list from 1906. And you can't see the family names on it, but you can see in the right column where title non-transmissible has been entered beside each of those family names. At the bottom of this image, there's a signature, Dilemmandir. There were actually 3 signatures on this image. They are witnesses to the treaty payment being made. And I took 2 of the signatures off because I thought they might identify which band this is. And in this instance, for this topic, it doesn't really matter which one. The 1899 report on Robinson Treaty annuities did not identify who was Indian and who was Métis. MNO relies on this report as evidence because it often uses the word half-breed. And with MNO, that's all it takes to turn Indian people into Métis people. So you understand exactly what I'm trying to say. Here's another way of explaining it. The 1899 report on Robinson Treaty annuities is an example of how a colonizer government used its political power and authority to manipulate the ethnic identity of our First Nations ancestors. The Métis Nation of Ontario, also a colonizer government, used the 1899 report to do exactly the same thing. Indian Affairs used it to decrease the Treaty Indian population. MNO used it to increase its Métis ancestor population. Indian Affairs used the report to strip people of their treaty rights, while MNO used it to strip people of their ethnic identity. But the evidence cited in the 1899 report was superficial, inadequate, and sometimes irrational. It also expressed a stereotypical belief about Indian people. Only full-blooded Indians are real Indians. MNO talks about the Killarney historic Métis community, but they can't substantiate it through the historic record. That's why they concentrate on pointing to the word half-breed all the time, playing on that racial stereotype. If the people were mixed ancestry, they must be Métis. According to one of the Jesuit missionaries, the Recollet family lived in Shebahonaning for several years before moving to the Manitoulin Island. The father, Joseph, worked for Etienne Dilemmandir for 8 years. Then he moved his family to the village of Wakwamacong. Some years later, 2 of the children, Marguerite and Madeline, moved back to Shebahonaning with their husbands. Their mother also came with them and lived with Marguerite. Madeline Recollet married Bena Gishigopenensi in 1857. They had 11 children. This family was later known by the name Bemanakaning, then the name Bena, and today they are known as the Bernard family. The image on the left is a baptism from the register of the Holy Cross Mission at Wakwamacong. And it says that in July of 1860, Father Hanapo, the Jesuit missionary, baptized Michelle Gishigopenensi, the child of Bernard Gishigopenensi and Madeline Recollet. The godfather was Louis Michiquat, and the godmother was Christine Wakagishik. The image on the right shows the birth record for Michelle's sister, Madeline. She was born 9 years later in 1869. And you see that on this record, the father's name is Bernard Bemanakaning. Here is an overview of the Gishigopenensi family. Who in this family did MNO declare to be a documented Métis? Nobody. Not Madeline, her husband, or either of their parents, and not any of their children, their grandchildren, or their great-grandchildren. So why is Madeline Recollet's family included in MNO's membership register as part of a verified Métis family line? Marguerite Recollet, who also called herself Marguerite Aquawak, married Ferdinand Rock in 1849. This is from the register at the Holy Cross Mission. And it says that Ferdinand Rock, the son of Jean-Baptiste Rock and Marie LaFrance, was married to Marguerite Recollet, daughter of Joseph Recollet and Madeleine Aquawak. The witnesses were Joseph Recollet and Marie Peltier. The Métis Nation of Ontario believes that Madeline's last name was Ignace, but that's incorrect. It was Aquawak. It's also written on this certificate of marriage from Holy Cross Mission, and it's also written in a lot of different Indian Affairs records. Aquawak is the name that was used under different spellings, but the same name. I've never seen the name Ignace used in any other records about Madeline. One other thing, in case people are wondering why baptismal and marriage records for our ancestors are typically found at Holy Cross Mission in Wakwamacong. Shebahonaning was an Indian mission. Over the years, we had built little chapels and then finally our own church. But because we did not have a resident missionary until 1903, we didn't have our own church register. That happened in 1906. I'll be talking more about the church and the Jesuits in later videos. Marguerite and Ferdinand had 15 children. MNO notes that the 1899 report on Robinson Treaty Annuities referred to Marguerite Recollet as a French half-breed, and that McCrae said, "The title of the Recollets is of the flimsiest character, I consider." McCrae also said that Marguerite and Madeline's connection to the treaty tract was through their mother. He said that neither their father nor Madeline's husband was on the treaty pay list. He was wrong. The father and Madeline's husband were on the treaty pay list, but apparently McCrae didn't know that. So he considered their entitlement to treaty benefits to be flimsy. McCrae's ideas about the roles of men and women have nothing to do with the issue of being Indian versus being Métis. Despite the fact that he called Marguerite a half-breed, he made her rights non-transmissible instead of taking her off the pay list. But he used that magic word half-breed to describe her. So the Métis Nation of Ontario made Marguerite Recollet a documented Métis. Shebahonaning, the Transmontaigne family. This is the baptismal record for Joseph Transmontaigne. He was baptized in June of 1852 in the chapel at Shebahonaning, and he was of the legitimate marriage of Joseph Transmontaigne and Marie Solomon. The godfather was Henry Solomon, and the godmother's name is not given in this record. In their verified Métis document, the Métis Nation of Ontario says that family members were identified in various ways as Métis in the historic record. In other words, the 1899 report on Robinson Treaty Annuities. We just saw the baptismal record for Joseph Transmontaigne Jr., born in 1852. He married Pauline Boudry, and his parents were Joseph Sr. and Marie Solomon. Joseph's sister, Marie Transmontaigne, is the foremother of all the Pilots of Killarney. According to the Métis Nation of Ontario, Joseph Sr., born in 1833, is a documented Métis because the 1899 report on Robinson Treaty Annuities described him as a Hudson's Bay Company employee who was said to have been a half-breed. So in 1899, Inspector McCrae heard a rumor that Joe was a half-breed, and that's enough for the Métis Nation of Ontario to change his identity to documented Métis. Here's Marie again, Joseph Sr.'s sister, this time with her husband, Pierre Pilot, and their children. No one in this family was declared a documented Métis either, including their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. So why is the Pilon family included in MNO's register as part of a verified Métis family line? The Pijikins family. Here are two baptismal records. One for Henry Solomon, born in 1797, and the other for his sister Marie Louise, born in 1799. They were baptized the same day at the Mission of St. Ignace of Michilimackinac. They were the children of William Solomon, who was an interpreter for the Indian Department for many years. The Métis Nation of Ontario says that many of the Solomons are identified as Métis in the historic record. In other words, the 1901 census, which identifies family members as Chippewa French breed, and the 1899 report on Robinson Treaty Annuities, which identifies a family member as a half-breed. Here is an overview of the Pijikins family. Here's a piece of evidence that MNO cites in their family line document about the Solomons. One of James Solomon's sons, William Alexander, was born in Killarney in 1861. The 1899 report on Robinson Treaty Annuities demonstrates that he did not view himself as an Indian. I believe it was pride not to be considered an Indian which caused him so long to refrain from having his family properly entered on the census list of his band. So this is a quote that MNO has provided from the 1899 report, and it's actually the Indian agent who is making that remark about William Alexander. There's no information here about how William Alexander viewed his own ancestry. And when the agent refers to him not having his family properly entered on the census list of his band, he's not saying that Alexander doesn't belong. He's saying the opposite. And he also is suggesting that William Alexander might be ashamed of being an Indian, and that's why he hasn't kept the department up to date about the number of people in his family. Whether or not that is true is another thing. It certainly is not, in my mind, any evidence at all that a person is Métis. Here's another example of MNO's evidence for a Métis identity. In their family line document, MNO discusses the census data about William Solomon's family. William is the son of Henry Solomon I. So first of all, here is the census data for 1881. Notice at the top of this sheet where the red arrow was pointing, that's the column for a person's origin, and the word Indian is written there. And there are ditto marks underneath that word going all the way down the page. The image at the top is the bottom of that census page that we were just looking at. And it shows you where the red arrow is. It shows you William Solomon's name. And underneath is the name of his wife, Goedanakwe. And the ditto marks are in the origin column. So they are also identified as Indian. And the image below that is the next page of the census that shows the rest of William Solomon's family, and they also are identified as Indian. This is the 1881 census. This is the census sheet for the 1891 census. And again, it's William Solomon's family, and those red lines on the left show you that a large portion of this page is taken up just by William Solomon's family. Some of his children are grown and they have families of their own on this census, but they're all marked together on it. And if you look at the red oval, it says Indian, and there are ditto marks all the way down the page. So they've all been identified as Indian. even though on this census that column was supposed to be checked if a person was French Canadian. In that census, that was the only question that was asked about ethnic origin. For whatever reason, the enumerator decided to put down that this family is Indian. The 1901 census, William Solomon's family. The red arrow is pointing towards the ethnic origin column, and it says Chip, which I can only assume means Chippewa. This is the third census in a row that he's been identified as Indian. 1881, 1891, and now 1901. In their verified Métis family document, MNO makes sure to point out that William Solomon, although he's classified as Chippewa on the 1901 census, is living beside the Taylor family, who is classified as Chippewa French breed. The Taylors have already been named documented Métis by MNO. And what they are doing in highlighting this information is claiming that living beside each other is an expression of Métis kinship, and that their claims about the Solomon family being Métis are made stronger by the fact that they are living beside a documented Métis family. But look who's living on the other side of the Solomon family. People who have also been classified as Chippewa. So does that turn the Solomons back into Indians? And what about all the families living on the other side of the Taylors? They've also been identified as Chippewa. The Taylor family is surrounded by Chippewa people. So wouldn't that also turn the Taylors from documented Métis into Indians? Particularly since they're all living together on the Sagamok Indian Reserve. MNO used this same strategy when discussing Marguerite Recollet, because in the 1871 census, she is shown living beside Marie Solomon and her son, and MNO has declared both of them to be documented Métis. But it doesn't work in that case either, because living on the other side of Marguerite is Mrs. Xavier Solomon, and she is identified on the census as Indian. I know this all sounds very silly, but these are the kinds of rationales that MNO used to label our ancestors documented Métis. This image of the burial record of Alexei Dilemmandir is from the Holy Cross Mission in Wikwemikong on Manitoulin Island. And it says that in 1901 in Killarney, the priest officiated at the burial of Alexei Dilemmandir, who was 94 years old and 9 months, born at Mackinac in 1806, the son of Etienne Dilemmandir, trader for the Hudson Bay Company, which is incorrect, and first colonist in Killarney, and Josette Sessagonaquay. The Métis Nation of Ontario says that many family members of Sessagonaquay's descendants were identified in various ways as Métis in the historic record. in other words, the 1901 census, and correspondence with the Deputy Minister of Marine and Fisheries. Here is an overview of the family of Etienne Dilemmandir and Josette Sessagonaqua. MNO declared Pierre Regis, a grandson of Sessagonaqua, to be a documented Métis, because in 1881 he was referred to as a half-breed in a letter written to the Department of Marine and Fisheries. Pierre Regis wrote back to the department and said that under the Indian Act of 1876, he was not legally entitled to receive treaty annuities. There's a lot more to this story, and as I've said before, I will be talking in detail about it in another video. I think all that's necessary to point out right now is that if treaty annuities are withheld from a person by Indian Affairs, it does not make that person Métis. Elizabeth Prue, a great-grandchild of Sessagonaqua, was discussed in the last video that I did, which she also was identified as a documented Métis by MNO, along with 3 of her children, because they were listed as other breed in the 1901 census. The father of the children was listed as an Ottawa Indian on the same census, and in the 1921 census, all of Elizabeth's children were listed as Ottawa, and their language was recorded as Ojibwe. In 1907, Elizabeth self-identified as Potawatomi and was included in the Worcester Roll, and I'll be discussing that in more detail in another video. The Métis Nation of Ontario also has something to say about Elizabeth's sister, Josephine. In their family line document, MNO says that while Rosalie moved to Killarney, her daughter Josephine stayed in the Sault Ste. Marie Métis community, where she married in 1895. But this is not true. Rosalie, the mother, was born on St. Joseph Island. When she came back to Killarney, she was 10 years old. Her daughter Josephine was not even born until 14 years later. Josephine was born and raised in Shebahonaning, and in 1892 she married Augustin Bernard. And here's an image of their marriage record that's at the Holy Cross Mission at Waquemacong. And he died a couple of years after their marriage. In 1895, Josephine Prue married Dan Bizion on the Thessalon Indian Reserve, where they were both living at the time. Josephine's name will come up again when I talk about the Worcester Roll. This table summarizes the evidence that MNO used to claim that our ancestors were Métis. They didn't bother declaring anyone in the Bernard or Pilot families to be a documented Métis. They just added them to their membership register without any evidence at all. Almost all the evidence they cite for our families being Métis is about someone calling a treaty Indian a half-breed, or an Indian agent claiming that someone is not proud to be an Indian. And then there's the ancestors that MNO turned into Métis people because they were living beside someone who was called a half-breed. In 1875, Indian Affairs investigated the treaty rights of the Dilemmandirs and the Solomons. Just the fact that an Indian agent wanted an investigation was enough for MNO to conclude that these families must be Métis. I'll be talking about that investigation and the outcome that MNO ignored in a later video. This table shows you how superficial and inadequate MNO's evidence is. Next time, I'll be looking at the information that is revealed in MNO's genealogical charts. A chart for every family that they say is a verified Métis family line. I think you'll find it very interesting.